Once I had the fin CNC'd out, the next step is to start finishing these edges. As you can see, they're pretty rough. So the first thing I want to do is make a divot in that aramid. So I just used the Dremel, make a furrow. Now I did that on all the edges that weren't on the fin tab. I don't need to do that on the fin tabs. But so for the leading edge of the front fin and the trailing edge of the rear fin, I cut out some oak pieces. The 45-degree point. We're going to laminate on here like so, to provide kind of a airfoil on the front leading edge and trailing edge of the fin. Now for this I'm using West Systems G-Flex flexible epoxy. I'm going to use that on pretty much all the edges when I'm working on these fins. So I get the epoxy into that trough that I created with the Dremel, and then I'll coat the that piece of oak as well on one side, on the flat bottom side. The first thing I do is mark it, make sure I don't need epoxy on the whole thing, but just mark where the epoxy approximately is going to go. And then get that epoxy, some epoxy spread on the bottom there. Alright, once I get that epoxy spread all over the bottom of that piece of oak, I simply just laid it on there, made sure that it had a good fit, and taped it on. And then I repeated that for all of the leading edges on the front fins and the trailing edges on the rear fins. And you can see some beads of epoxy that are, a little messy there. I just made sure I cleaned everything up before I put any tape on. I'm not going to be too worried about it. Like, it doesn't have to be, I want it aligned right, but everything is going to get sanded and cut the size once everything's cured. So once these were on, I let them cure, and this is what it looks like when they were done. And then I just used a bandsaw to kind of make it straight, so there was a nice point at the front that was going to sit right on the tube, and on the other side, on the top side, so that's what it's going to look like on the tube, and then on the other side, on the top, it's nice and flat. Now you notice I left it a little proud right now because I'm going to sand everything down. Now for this, on the other sides that don't get that, I'm just going to literally make a nice epoxy edge and make it square. So just like the leading edges there that I just showed, I'm just going to fill the whole wells up with epoxy, and then I'll sand everything down once it's ready to go. Alright, so now this is kind of tacky. It's not dry, but it's still soft. But it's settled into that aramid a little bit into that Kevlar. So I want to top it off right now because it's kind of dipped down before it gets hard while it's still tacky, and it'll blend together nicely with some more epoxy. Ideally, when I'm done here, it'll actually, the epoxy be just a little bit over the edges so that I can sand it down flat, and the fin will be I'm going to end up with air bubbles in here, I know that. When we're done at this, I'll just go over it with a little bit of regular laminating epoxy. Smooth it all out and sand it down. One of the key things is I don't plan to paint these fins. I want that carbon fiber look to shine through, so that's why I'm going to make all the edges nice and clean, and the surfaces clean by the end. So these are eventually going to be black. I'll use, like I said, I was going to use laminating epoxy at the end, and I'll just put some black dye in it, and I'm hoping that I can make it nice and flat and clean looking. So next thing up, we got to sand everything flat now. All the edges, all the surfaces, everywhere where all that epoxy laid up. We'll just put it on the oscillating belt sander and go. So like I said, sand up all the edges, the surfaces, make sure everything's nice and flat, and you get all that epoxy that dripped off. Alright, with everything sanded, the next thing I did was laminate the whole thing with a piece of carbon fiber fabric, just to tie it all together. I felt like, making sure that that piece of oak doesn't come flying off, that all the surface imperfections, anything that I might have missed or can't fix by sanding, a nice vacuum bagged piece of carbon fiber fabric right on top made it perfectly smooth and looked really, really nice when it was done. So I trimmed all that off the edges and then went back to the sander. Now, the other thing I did was clear coat the surfaces with just plain laminated epoxy. And once I had all those sanded flat, like I said, I put a little laminating epoxy with black dye on it on all of the edges, so that it would be nice and perfectly smooth and black. Let that cure, and then this is what they looked like. So those surface coats did get an 800 and 1500, grit sanding, and then another coat of epoxy because I don't want to paint these. This is how they're going to go on the on the rocket, and I might clear coat them with spray paint clear at the end when I lock everything in. But this is it. They're pretty much done, and they came out really, really good. I'm very happy with the way these came out. So on to the next parts of the rocket.